Ink dried faster than tears in the bitter northern wind. Emily didn't cry anyway. Crying was a luxury for women who weren't traded for 200 sacks of winter wheat and a promise of border peace. They called him the Beast of Hyridge, an alpha king who broke men with his bare hands and wives with his temper. She signed her name expecting a short, miserable life. But the stories lied. What she woke up to changed the north forever. The parchment was thick-yellowed and smelled faintly of vinegar. Emily stared at the heavy black lettering, her eyes tracing the Latin script that reduced her 22 years of life to a transaction. 50 miles of contested grazing land along the Redwater River, access to the salt mines, 200 sacks of grain. In exchange, Emily of House Arryn would belong to King Gareth of the Northern Reaches. Sign it quickly, her father muttered. Lord Alden stood near the hearth, though the meagre fire did little to warm the damp stone of their ancestral hall. He rubbed his hands together, his gaze darting nervously toward the heavy oak doors. He does not like to be kept waiting. Emily picked up the quill. She didn't look at her father. There was no point in looking for guilt in a man who had only ever seen his daughters as currency. Her 2 younger sisters had been sold to southern merchants for gold. Emily, the eldest, the quietest, the one who managed the castle's dwindling ledgers and ordered the patching of its leaking roofs, was being sold to a monster for survival. She pressed the nib to the paper and wrote her name. Emily. No flourish, just a steady hard line. The great doors of the hall groaned open, cutting off whatever excuse her father was about to offer. The draught that followed smelled of pine needles, wet earth, and something sharper. Something feral. Gareth walked in. He did not look like a king. He wore no crown, no velvet cloaks lined with ermine. He wore boiled leather scarred by blades and a heavy wolf-pelt mantle that looked as though it had been dragged through the mud. He was a massive man, broad in the shoulders, with a thick dark beard and hair that hung past his jaw, damp from the sleet outside. He didn't swagger. He just walked to the table with heavy, exhausted steps. His eyes, a startling pale amber, flicked to Emily. They held no malice. They barely held interest. "Is it done?" Gareth's voice was a low rumble. It vibrated in the floorboards. "Signed and witnessed your grace." Lord Alden said, his voice embarrassingly shrill. He bowed. Gareth didn't acknowledge the bow. He pulled a dagger from his belt, sliced his own thumb, and pressed a bloody print next to Emily's signature. "Have her belongings in the wagon. We ride before the sun sets." "Before sunset," Lord Alden stammered. "But the feast. We have prepared roasted fowl and... the roads will freeze by midnight." Gareth interrupted, turning his back on them. "Keep your fowl, Alden. Feed your serfs. I came for a bride and a treaty, not a banquet." Emily stood. Her wool dress was stiff and heavy, offering warmth but no grace. "My belongings are already packed, my lord," she said. Gareth paused at the door, looking back over his shoulder. For a second those amber eyes sharpened, fixing on her face. He gave a single curt nod. "Good. You have sense." The wedding was nothing more than a spoken oath in the muddy courtyard of her father's keep. A priest shivering in the sleet mumbled the rites. Emily kept her hands clasped in front of her, feeling the cold seep through her thin leather gloves. Gareth stood beside her, a mountain of a man, radiating an unnatural, stifling heat. She could smell him now. Sweat leather and wood smoke. When the priest finished, there was no kiss. Gareth simply turned to his men and barked an order to mount up. The journey north took 5 days. 5 days of biting frost and jolting wagon wheels that rattled Emily's teeth in her skull. She sat in the back of a covered cart, wrapped in her threadbare cloak, watching the landscape turn from grey autumn to brutal white winter. She knew what werewolves were. Everyone did. They were a violent, territorial breed. men who shifted into beasts under the moon, driven by instinct and rage. The Southern Lords whispered that Gareth had ripped the throat out of the previous Alpha King to take the throne, that his men ate their enemies, that his castle was a den of blood and bone. Emily expected cruelty. She expected to be dragged into his tent at night and used. She sat in the wagon, her hands curled into fists, waiting for the inevitable assault. It never came. On the second night, a blizzard caught them on the plains. The convoy halted. Emily sat shivering in the dark, her lips blue, her fingers numb. The canvas flap of the wagon parted, and Gareth loomed in the opening. Emily stiffened. This is it, she thought, closing her eyes. Something heavy hit her lap. She gasped, opening her eyes to see a massive bear fur blanket. Wrap up, Gareth said, his voice flat. If you freeze to death, I lose the salt mine access. He didn't wait for her to answer. The flap fell shut. Emily sat in the freezing dark, staring at the canvas. She pulled the fur over her shoulders. It was heavy, reeking of old smoke, and incredibly warm. She buried her face in the fur. She didn't cry, but for the first time in 3 days she slept. Hyridge Keep was not a ruin of bones and blood. It was a fortress of dark stone and ancient timber, perched on a sheer cliff overlooking a valley of black pines. It was loud. Dogs barked in the kennels, blacksmiths hammered iron at the forges, and men yelled coarse jokes across the courtyard. It was practical. It was alive. Emily was numb by the time her boots hit the cobblestones. Her legs felt like lead. A stout woman with greying hair and missing teeth met her at the wagon, ushering her inside out of the biting wind. "Come on, my lady. Up the stairs with you. Fire's lit." The woman didn't bow. She just grabbed Emily by the elbow and marched her through the great hall. The hall was packed with soldiers. Some were entirely human. Others had the heavy brows and thick features of wolves who lived more in fur than in skin. They paused their drinking to watch her pass. Emily kept her chin high, refusing to shrink under their stares. She was a bargaining chip, yes, but she was still a noblewoman. She was led up 3 flights of winding stone stairs and pushed into a large chamber at the end of a long corridor. The heavy oak door shut behind her with a definitive thud. Emily stood in the center of the room. It was stark. A massive 4-poster bed draped in furs dominated the space. A heavy oak table sat near the window, littered with maps and ledgers. A fire roared in a stone hearth, fighting back the chill. She waited. The tension in her stomach coiled tighter and tighter. This was the wedding night. The treaty demanded an heir, or at least the consummation of the union, to make it binding before the eyes of the church and the pack. An hour passed. She stood by the fire, her hands trembling slightly, staring at the flames. Finally, the door latch clicked. Gareth stepped inside. He had shed his heavy pelts and armor, wearing only a linen tunic and rough spun trousers. He looked battered. Bruises painted his forearms, and a fresh cut leaked a thin line of red down his cheek. He didn't look at her. He walked straight to the wash basin, poured water from an iron pitcher, and began scrubbing his face and hands. The water turned a muddy grey. Emily took a slow, deep breath. She reached for the laces at the front of her heavy wool dress. Her fingers were stiff, fumbling with the leather ties. "What are you doing?" His voice stopped her. Emily looked up. Gareth was watching her, a rough towel pressed to his face. His amber eyes were narrowed, reflecting the firelight. "I am preparing for bed, my lord," Emily said. Her voice was remarkably steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Gareth tossed the towel onto the table. He walked toward her. Emily forced herself not to step back. She held her ground as his massive frame shadowed her. He stopped 2 feet away, looking down at her hands, which still gripped the laces of her gown. "Do you want to freeze?" he asked. Emily blinked. "No, my lord." "Then leave the dress on. The drafts in this room are foul. He stepped around her, walked to the bed, and pulled back the heavy furs. He didn't demand she follow. He didn't pull her into his arms. He simply laid down on the far left side of the mattress, groaned as his back hit the boards, and closed his eyes. "Get some sleep, Emily," he muttered. "Breakfast is at dawn. If you're late, the men will eat all the bacon." Emily stood rooted to the floor. "My lord." Gareth opened one eye. "What? The consummation!" She forced the words out, hating the heat that rose in her cheeks. "The treaty requires it." Gareth let out a short, harsh bark of a laugh. "The treaty requires your father to send me wheat, and it requires me not to burn his castle down. The men who wrote those church laws are 300 miles south, sitting in warm rooms. They aren't here." He shifted, turning his back to her. "I spent 14 hours in a saddle, Emily. I am tired. You are terrified. I'm not touching you. Come to bed and sleep." Emily stood in the quiet room, the howling wind outside rattling the iron hinges of the window shutters. She looked at the man, the beast who had terrified her nightmares for a month. He was already asleep. His breathing was deep and even. Slowly, her hands shaking for an entirely different reason, now she unlaced her stiff boots and set them by the hearth. She kept her thick dress on, walked to the right side of the bed, and slipped under the furs. She lay stiff as a board on the very edge of the mattress, staring at the heavy timber ceiling. The heat radiating from Gareth's side of the bed was incredible, acting like a furnace against the bitter cold of the room. She listened to the steady rhythm of his breathing. She had braced herself for heartbreak. She had prepared her soul to be shattered, to be used to become a hollowed-out ghost haunting a northern keep. Instead, she lay in the dark, warm and untouched, listening to an alpha king snore. Emily woke to the sound of a hammer striking an anvil. She blinked, disoriented by the heavy grey light filtering through the frost-rimmed window. The air in the room was biting cold. She turned her head. The left side of the bed was empty. The sheets were cold. Gareth had been up for hours. Emily sat up, pushing her tangled hair out of her face. For a moment, the old panic flared. Had she offended him? Had he left her here to be locked away? She slid out of bed and hurried to the heavy oak door. She grabbed the iron ring and pulled. It wasn't locked. The door swung open with a creak, revealing the empty, drafty corridor. There were no maids waiting with silk gowns or hot water. No guards posted to keep her confined. Emily closed the door, walked to her travel trunk, and pulled out a fresh woolen dress, a thick shawl, and a comb. She dressed quickly, her breath pluming in the frigid air, and splashed her face with the freezing water left in the basin. She made her way downstairs, following the smell of wood smoke, roasting oats, and rendering fat. The great hall was mostly empty, save for a few hounds sleeping by the hearth, and a servant sweeping the rushes. Emily stepped out into the courtyard. The cold hit her like a physical blow, snapping her senses sharp. The fortress was a hive of aggressive industry. Wagons were being unloaded. Boys were carrying bundles of firewood stacked twice as high as their heads, and men-at-arms were sparring in the mud with blunted swords. No one paid her any mind. She was just another body in a busy keep. She found Gareth near the stables. He was out of his armor, wearing a heavy leather apron over his tunic. He was holding the hind leg of a massive, irritable war horse between his knees, while a blacksmith examined the hoof. Gareth's sleeves were rolled up, revealing thick, muscular forearms, corded with veins, and a dusting of dark hair. "You cut the frog too deep, Elias." Gareth was saying, his tone conversational but firm. "He's favoring his right side. Pare it down and reset the shoe." "Aye, my lord. I see it now." The blacksmith muttered. Gareth dropped the horse's leg and gave the beast a rough pat on the flank. He turned to wipe his hands on a rag and saw Emily standing a few yards away, shivering in her shawl. He didn't smile, but the hard line of his mouth softened a fraction. "You missed the bacon." "You didn't wake me." Emily replied, her voice carrying over the ringing of the forge. Gareth tossed the rag to a stable boy. "You look like you hadn't slept in a month. Come here." He walked toward a wooden table set up under an awning near the kitchens, gesturing for her to follow. On the table sat a battered tin plate, holding a half-eaten loaf of dark bread and a wedge of hard yellow cheese. Gareth tore off a chunk of the bread and handed it to her. "Eat. You'll need the fat on your bones to survive the wind up here." Emily took the bread. It was dense, tough, and tasted faintly of ash, but she was starving. She took a bite, chewing slowly as she watched him. He poured a cup of watered ale from a jug and drank it in one long pull. "What am I to do today, my lord?" Emily asked, swallowing the dry bread. Gareth paused, setting the cup down. He looked at her, his pale amber eyes studying her face. "Do my duties," Emily clarified, pulling her shawl tighter. "In my father's house I managed the ledgers, oversaw the pantries, and negotiated with the wool merchants. I assume you have a steward who handles such things here, but I must have some purpose." She met his gaze squarely. "I will not sit in a tower and wait to die of boredom." Gareth stared at her for a long moment. Then a low chuckle rumbled in his chest. It was a rough, unused sound. "My steward," Gareth said, leaning against the wooden table, "is a man named Vane. He is brilliant with a sword and entirely useless with numbers. He has been stealing from my own winter stores for 3 years because he doesn't know how to carry a sum. The South Tower roof has been leaking since last spring, and the wool merchants from Oakhaven have been overcharging me by 20%. He crossed his arms over his broad chest. "I didn't bring you here to breed, Emily. I have 100 warriors who can hold a shield wall. I don't have a single person in this keep who can read a trade contract without moving their lips." Emily stared at him, the bread heavy in her hand. "You brought me here to work. Your father mentioned in his desperate letters that you ran his estate. I needed a quartermaster and a political advisor. The marriage was just the only way to get your father to hand you over without demanding gold I don't have." He looked out over the muddy, chaotic courtyard. "This pack is strong, Emily, but we are unorganized. We survive by teeth and claws, and winter is coming. We need a mind." He turned back to her. The beast of the north, the monster who supposedly tore men limb from limb, was looking at her with quiet, desperate respect. "The ledgers are on the desk in our chamber," Gareth said softly. "The keep is yours to run. No one will question your authority. If they do, tell me, and I will throw them off the battlements." He meant it as a joke, but his tone was deadpan. Emily felt a strange, sudden warmth bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with the heavy wool she wore. She looked at her half-eaten bread. She thought of her father's damp, miserable castle, where she was invisible, a burden to be sold. She looked at the towering, bruised man in front of her, who had just handed her the keys to his kingdom because he recognized her competence. "I'll need my own horse," Emily said, taking another bite of the bread. "And a ledger with fresh parchment. Vane's records are likely a disaster." Gareth's mouth twitched into a genuine, rare smile. It changed his entire face, making him look less like a king and more like a man who had finally found an ally. "I'll have Elias saddle the grey mare," he said. "Welcome to Hyridge, Emily." Emily watched him walk back to the forge, the northern wind pulling at her hair. She had expected to be broken today. She had expected heartbreak and blood. Instead, she had a keep to run, a pack to feed, and a husband who listened to her. She finished her bread, dusted the crumbs from her skirt, and marched back toward the great hall. There was work to do. The records room was located in the western keep directly above the armory. It smelled of damp parchment, mouse droppings, and old wax. To Emily, it smelled like a battlefield. She spent her first 3 days in Hyridge, buried in the rot of Vane's administration. Gareth had not exaggerated. Vane was a towering, scarred brute of a man who looked like he could carry a draft horse on his shoulders. As a steward, he was a catastrophe. "I don't see the issue," Vane grumbled. He stood in the doorway, his massive frame blocking the meagre light from the corridor. He was chewing on a piece of dried venison, eyeing Emily with a mixture of suspicion and deep irritation. "We have meat, we have grain. The men eat." Emily didn't look up. She sat wrapped in her heavy shawl, her fingers stained black with ink. She deliberately dragged her quill across a fresh sheet of parchment, drawing a sharp, straight line. "You have meat and grain for now, Vane." She said, her voice quiet, but carrying the distinct carrying pitch of the southern nobility. "But you are hemorrhaging coin." She rotated the ledger, pointing a slender, ink-stained finger at a column of chaotic scratches. "The Oakhaven wool, purchased at 40 copper pieces a bundle. Southern market rate is 22. The salt imports. You traded prime winter pelts for rock salt at a 1-to-1 weight ratio. Salt is heavy. Fur is light. You gave away a fortune for seasoning. The iron shipment's 3 missing wagons in the last quarter. Written off as lost in snow. Iron does not evaporate." Vane stopped chewing. His amber eyes, a shade darker than Gareth's, narrowed. The faint low rumble of a growl vibrated in his chest. It was an involuntary sound, the instinct of a wolf being challenged in his territory. Emily finally looked up. She set her quill down. She did not flinch. She had grown up under the heavy hand of Lord Alden. She knew how angry men looked. A wolf was just a man with sharper teeth. "Are you going to bite me, Vane, or are you going to help me find the missing iron?" The growl died in the steward's throat. He blinked clearly, thrown by her utter lack of fear. Human women, in his experience, usually cried or fainted when the pack showed its teeth. Emily just looked bored. "The iron was handled by Master Hewitt's men." Vane muttered, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "They said the wagons broke axes on the pass, left them to rust. Then we will deduct the cost of the lost wagons from Master Hewitt's next payment." Emily replied smoothly, dipping her quill back into the inkwell. "And we will renegotiate the wool. You will send a rider to Oakhaven today. Tell them the King of the Northern Reaches requires their chief merchant present at Hyridge before the first hard freeze, or we close the trade road." Vane stared at her. He looked from her small, pale hands to the heavily annotated ledger. A slow, grudging respect dawned in his eyes. He didn't understand the numbers, but he understood a commanding officer when he heard one. "Aye, my lady," Vane said. He gave a stiff, awkward bow. "I'll send the rider." When he left, Emily exhaled a shaky breath, her shoulders dropping a fraction. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She pressed her palms flat against the cold wood of the desk to steady them. Show no weakness, she reminded herself. Not here. Not ever. That evening the great hall was deafening. A hunting party had returned with 3 massive boars, and the pack was celebrating. Ale flowed from wooden casks, and men tore at roasted meat with their bare hands. Emily sat at the high table to Gareth's right. Her plate held a modest slice of pork and boiled root vegetables. She ate methodically, watching the room. Gareth sat beside her, radiating his usual furnace-like heat. He was drinking water, not ale. He watched his men with the sharp, calculating eyes of a general, not a king lounging at a feast. "Vane complained about you," Gareth said suddenly. Emily paused, her fork suspended in the air. "Did he?" "He said you looked at him like he was a slow child who had tracked mud onto a rug." Gareth didn't look at her, but the corner of his mouth was lifted. "He also said you found the missing iron." "It wasn't missing. It was stolen through gross negligence," Emily corrected, placing her fork down. "I have drafted a summons for the Oakhaven merchants. We are going to restructure your trade agreements. If this pack is going to survive a harsh winter, we cannot afford to be swindled." Gareth turned his head. The torchlight caught the severe angles of his face. "Master Hewitt is a slippery bastard. He comes up here with velvet cloaks and sweet wine, and my men think him a friend. He will not easily give up his margins." "He will give them up, or he will freeze on the wrong side of your mountains," Emily said. Gareth held her gaze. The noise of the hall seemed to fade to a dull roar. He reached out and picked up his iron goblet, his large fingers brushing against the sleeve of her woolen dress. It was the closest he had come to touching her since she arrived. "You are ruthless, Emily." "I am practical," she corrected. "Ruthlessness is breaking a man's legs. Practicality is checking his ledgers so you don't have to." Gareth let out a low, rumbling laugh. It was a good sound, rich and deeply human. Several wolves at the lower tables glanced up, surprised to hear their alpha laugh. "Eat your meat, my queen," Gareth said, his voice dropping to a softer timbre. "You'll need your strength for the merchants." The first real snow fell 3 weeks later. It didn't drift gracefully from the sky. It drove in horizontally, an aggressive, blinding sheet of white that buried the courtyard in a foot of ice by noon. Hyridge shifted inward. The patrols were shortened. The forges ran hotter. The wolves spent more time indoors, which meant the tension in the keep grew thick enough to cut with a blade. Confined spaces and predatory instincts were a volatile mix. Emily moved through the keep with a heavy ring of iron keys at her belt. She had taken over the pantries, the armory logs, and the servant rotations. The pack had stopped looking at her as the human bride and started treating her as a fixture of the fortress. They called her the Lady, with a gruff, clipped respect. The peace shattered on a Tuesday. Emily was in the lower kitchens, counting sacks of dried apples when she heard the snarling. It wasn't the drunken arguing of men. It was the deep, guttural sound of beasts preparing to kill. She dropped her slate and ran up the stone steps, bursting through the heavy doors into the great hall. The tables had been shoved aside. In the center of the room, 2 massive men were circling each other. One was Kyle, a lieutenant with a scarred jaw. The other was Torin, a younger, broad-shouldered scout. Both were half-shifted. Their eyes glowed a sickly yellow. Their fingernails had elongated into dark, thick claws, and their teeth were bared. Blood dripped from a long gash on Torin's forearm. The rest of the pack formed a tight, silent ring around them, waiting for the bloodletting. "Enough!" Emily's voice cracked like a whip across the silent hall. The wolves didn't stop. They didn't even look at her. The bloodlust was too high. Cale lunged his claws, swiping toward Torin's throat. "I said enough." Emily stepped directly into the ring. A collective gasp went up from the human servants. Vane lunged forward to grab her, but he was too late. Emily walked straight into the space between the 2 snarling men. She didn't have a weapon. She just had a deep, unyielding fury that her meticulously organized afternoon was being disrupted by idiocy. Cale halted his lunge so violently he nearly fell backward. Torin froze, his chest heaving. To strike the Alpha's mate was an immediate death sentence. To accidentally scratch her in a brawl would mean a slow, agonizing execution. "What is the meaning of this?" Emily demanded, looking back and forth between the 2 men. Up close, the heat radiating from their half-shifted bodies was suffocating. They smelled of copper and ozone. "He took my hunting claim." Cale growled, his voice distorted, thick with saliva. "The elk run by the Black Pines. It's mine." "Your squad hasn't brought down an elk in 3 weeks." Torin snarled back. "My men are hungry. The claim is forfeit." "I will tear your throat out for that." "You will do absolutely nothing." Emily interrupted, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. She pointed at Kyle. "Your squad patrols the western ridge. The snow drifts there are 6 feet deep. You are expending more energy climbing the drifts than you yield in meat. She turned to Torin. Your squad is lighter faster. You patrol the valley basin, but you are hunting small game. Both men stared at her, their glowing eyes blinking in confusion. The red haze of their anger was being short-circuited by logistics. You are fighting over a claim neither of you is optimizing, Emily said, crossing her arms. Torin, you will take the elk run. Kale, you are angry because you feel disrespected, not because you want to wade through waist-deep snow to shoot an arrow. I am reassigning your squad to the eastern road to guard the lumber carts. It pays an extra ration of salt pork a week, and you don't have to freeze your boots off in the pines. Agreed. The hall was dead silent. The pack watched the tiny human woman completely dismantle a lethal territorial dispute with a ledger in her head. Kyle blinked. The yellow slowly faded from his eyes, returning to a muddy brown. His claws retracted. An extra ration. Every Friday, Emily confirmed. Torin wiped the blood from his arm, his shoulders slumping. I'll take the elk run. Then the matter is settled. Go to the healer, Torin. You are bleeding on my clean rushes. Emily turned on her heel and walked back toward the kitchens. As she pushed open the doors, she glanced up at the balcony overlooking the hall. Gareth was standing there. He was fully dressed in his leather armor, leaning against the wooden railing. He must have been watching the entire time. He didn't say a word. He just slowly, deliberately bowed his head to her. That night, the fire in their bedchamber burned low, casting long, dancing shadows against the stone walls. Emily sat at her desk, finishing the daily logs. Gareth was sitting in a heavy leather armchair by the hearth, a whetstone in one hand and a hunting knife in the other. The rhythmic shh of steel against stone was the only sound in the room. You shouldn't have stepped between them. Gareth's voice broke the silence. He didn't stop sharpening the blade. Emily didn't look up from her inkwell. They were going to kill each other over an administrative error. It was inefficient. They are wolves, Emily. When the blood is up, they don't see the Alpha's queen. They just see meat. He paused, lowering the knife. He looked at her. His expression shadowed. If Kyle had not stopped. He stopped. Emily closed the ledger and turned in her chair to face him. Because he knew you would kill him if he didn't. Your authority protected me. No. Gareth shook his head, a heavy, tired movement. They stopped because they respect you. You didn't cower. You commanded. He set the knife and whetstone on the small table beside him. I have led this pack for 10 years. I lead by force. I beat the challengers bloody until they submit. It is exhausting. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his massive hands clasped loosely together. In the dim light, he looked ancient, burdened by the weight of 100 violent men. You lead by logic. Gareth said softly. You give them order. Wolves crave order just as much as they crave blood. I didn't realize how badly we needed you. Emily stared at him. The cynical, bruised heart in her chest gave a strange, painful flutter. She had been sold to this man. She had prepared for a monster. But sitting in the firelight, all she saw was a tired king begging for a partner. She stood up, walked across the cold floorboards, and stopped in front of his chair. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then reached out and laid her hand flat against his jaw. His skin was rough with stubble, burning hot against her cold fingers. Gareth went completely still. His amber eyes flicked up to hers, wide and entirely vulnerable. He didn't pull away. Slowly he turned his head, pressing his cheek into her palm, closing his eyes with a ragged exhale. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't a consummation. It was an anchor. And for Emily, it was the moment the North truly became her home. Master Hewitt arrived 3 days before the heavy blizzard season locked the mountain passes. He brought a train of 5 wagons, 20 armed guards, and an attitude of profound condescension. He was a stout, ruddy-faced man, draped in heavy southern velvets that looked ridiculous against the backdrop of Hyridge's brutal architecture. He strode into the great hall, wiping snow from his brow, a false, booming smile on his face. Emily and Gareth waited for him at the high table. Gareth sat slouched in his great chair, his heavy fur mantle draped over his broad shoulders, his face a mask of bored indifference. Emily sat beside him, an open ledger resting on the table, her quill neatly aligned next to her inkwell. "King Gareth," Hewitt called out, bowing with a flourish. "Winter bites hard this year. I brought 3 casks of sweet Dornish wine to warm your blood, and a crate of candied figs, a gift for your hospitality." Gareth didn't move. He leaned his head against his knuckles. "Master Hewitt, you are late." Hewitt waved a dismissive, gloved hand. "The snow's on the pass, your grace. It slows the horses. But we are here now, ready to exchange the season's goods. I understand your steward Vane sent word regarding the wool prices." He chuckled a wet, patronizing sound. "I'm sure it was a simple misunderstanding. Math is not the strong suit of a warrior." "It was no misunderstanding, Master Hewitt." Emily's voice was clear and cold, cutting through the hall like shards of ice. Hewitt stopped his approach. He looked at Emily, really looking at her for the first time. His smile faltered slightly as he took in her plain wool dress and her severe, unsmiling face. "And you must be the new bride. Lady Emily of Arryn, I presume I have done business with your father." "Then you know my father is an idiot who trades gold for rusted iron," Emily said bluntly. Several wolves standing near the hearth snorted in amusement. Hewitt's face flushed. "My lady, I assure you, I have reviewed the trade logs for the past 3 years. Master Hewitt." Emily interrupted, picking up her quill. She didn't raise her voice, but she commanded the room entirely. "You have been charging Hyridge a 40% markup on southern wool, while buying our northern winter pelts at a fraction of their market value. Furthermore, 3 wagons of iron vanished under your guard last winter. Wagons you claimed were lost, yet our scouts found the broken axles stripped of their cargo." Hewitt puffed out his chest, turning away from Emily to address Gareth directly. "Your Grace, I will not stand here and be insulted by a southern girl who doesn't understand the cost of transporting goods over ice." "Address the Queen!" Gareth rumbled. His voice was low, but it vibrated through the stone floor. He didn't shift his posture, but his amber eyes locked onto Hewitt with predatory focus. "She handles the keep. I just kill things." Hewitt swallowed hard. The silence in the hall was sudden and suffocating. The 20 armed guards he had brought suddenly looked very small, surrounded by 80 scarred werewolves who were slowly circling closer to the center of the room. Hewitt turned back to Emily, sweating despite the chill in the air. What is it you want, my lady?" "Restitution," Emily said. She slid a fresh piece of parchment across the table. "This is the new contract. We will purchase your wool at 18 copper a bundle. We will sell you our pelts at 40 silver a crate. You will deduct the cost of the stolen iron from this season's ledger entirely. If you refuse, we will seize your wagons as a tax for theft, and you will walk back to Oakhaven in the snow." Hewitt stared at the parchment as if it were a venomous snake. 18 copper. My lady that leaves me with barely any margin. It is highway robbery." "It is a fair southern market rate, minus a convenience fee for my time," Emily replied, her face entirely blank. "Sign the contract, Master Hewitt. The king is losing his patience." Gareth let out a low, theatrical growl in the back of his throat. Hewitt flinched violently. He looked at the massive Alpha King, then at the ring of wolves watching him with hungry eyes, and finally at the small, relentless woman sitting at the table. He was trapped. He reached out with a trembling hand, took the quill, and signed the parchment. "Leave the goods in the courtyard," Emily ordered, pulling the contract back and blowing softly on the wet ink. "Vane will see you out." Hewitt bowed stiffly and hurried out of the hall, his guards practically running to keep up. When the doors slammed shut, a beat of silence hung in the air. Then Kyle let out a sharp, barking laugh. It was followed by another, and then the entire hall erupted into cheers. Men hammered their tankards against the wooden tables, howling and stamping their feet. They weren't cheering for a battle won with swords. They were cheering for a slaughter executed with ink. Emily looked out over the chaotic, joyful hall. A small, genuine smile touched the corners of her mouth. Beside her, Gareth reached out and covered her ink-stained hand with his heavy, warm palm. He leaned in his breath, brushing her ear entirely, ignoring the noise of his celebrating pack. "I have never," Gareth murmured, his voice thick with an emotion Emily had never heard from him before, "seen anything more terrifying in my entire life." Emily turned her hand over, lacing her fingers through his. "You're welcome, my lord." The deep winter did not arrive with a whisper. It hit Hyridge like a battering ram. For 4 weeks, the sun was nothing but a pale smudge behind thick iron-grey clouds. Snow drifted as high as the armory windows, sealing the fortress in a cocoon of ice and howling wind. Inside, the keep ran like a well-oiled machine. Emily's rationing meant there was hot stew twice a day, the fires never died, and the men had dry boots. But the wilderness outside the walls was unforgiving, and the pack still had to patrol its borders. It was a Tuesday evening when the horn blew. It was a single, long, jagged note that cut through the noise of the great hall. Emily dropped her quill. The hall fell deathly silent. That was not the horn for returning hunters. It was the distress call. She ran. She pushed through the heavy wooden doors, her woolen skirts dragging in the fresh snow as she hit the courtyard. A dozen men were already there, holding torches that hissed and spat in the wind. Through the heavy iron gates came 3 horses. Kyle was leading them. He looked exhausted, his face covered in frost and dried blood. Across the saddle of the massive black destrier in the center lay Gareth. He was unconscious. "Get him inside!" Kyle roared, his voice cracking. "Move your dogs!" Vane sprinted forward, his massive arms wrapping around Gareth's torso, hauling the alpha off the horse. Gareth's head lolled back. His armor was gone, his tunic torn to shreds. His right side was a mangled mess of torn flesh and dark, sluggishly flowing blood. Emily's stomach plummeted, but her mind snapped into cold, sharp focus. Panic was a luxury for the unprepared. "Bring him to our chamber. Not the healing ward, it's too cold." Emily ordered, her voice cutting through the shouting. "Elias, fetch the healer. Tell him to bring willowbark needle and gut. You boy." She pointed at a terrified stable hand. "Run to the kitchens. I want 3 kettles of boiling water and clean linen. Now." They carried him up the winding stairs. Gareth was heavy, a dead weight of dense muscle and bone, and it took Vane, Torin, and Cale to hoist him onto the heavy oak bed. "What happened?" Emily demanded. She was already stripping her heavy shawl off, tossing it to the floor, and rolling up her sleeves. "Poachers." Kyle spat, pacing at the foot of the bed. His eyes were flashing between human brown and wolf yellow. "Southern scum. They set traps in the black pines, bear traps, but they weren't iron, my lady. They were lined with silver." Emily inhaled sharply. Silver didn't just cut a werewolf, it burned them from the inside out. It halted their rapid healing. It was poison. The healer, a frail, nervous man named Corin, rushed into the room carrying a leather satchel. He took one look at the gaping, blackened wound on Gareth's ribs and paled. His hands began to shake violently. "The silver! It's still in there!" Corin stammered, dropping his satchel on the table. "Shards of it. The trap shattered when he ripped it open. I cannot dig it out. My hands." "If you don't get it out, the rot will reach his heart by morning." Vane growled, grabbing the old man by the collar. "Let him go, Vane." Emily snapped. She stepped up to the table, opened the satchel, and pulled out a pair of long iron tongs and a small, sharp scalpel. She poured a splash of clear, brutal grain alcohol over the tools. She turned back to the bed. Gareth was deathly pale, sweat pooling in the hollows of his collarbones. His breathing was shallow and ragged. Emily climbed onto the mattress, kneeling beside his immense frame. "Hold him down," she ordered the three warriors. "My lady, you cannot—" Cale started. "Hold him down!" Emily shouted. It was the loudest she had ever spoken in Hyridge. "When the knife hits the silver, he will shift. He will thrash. If he moves, I will sever an artery, and he will bleed out on these sheets. Pin his shoulders and his legs. Now." The men obeyed. Vane took the shoulders, his massive weight pressing the Alpha into the mattress. Cale and Torin took a leg each. Emily took a breath, steadying her hands. They did not shake. She pressed the scalpel into the blackened, ruined flesh of Gareth's side. Gareth's eyes flew open. They were not human. They were blazing, feral, predatory gold. A roar ripped from his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that rattled the window panes. His body bucked with terrifying force, nearly throwing the three massive wolves off him. "Hold him!" Emily yelled. She didn't look at his terrifying face. She looked at the wound. She dug. Blood coated her fingers hot and slick. The smell of burning flesh and copper filled the room. She found the first shard of silver deep in the muscle. She gripped it with the tongs and pulled it out, dropping the bloody metal into a tin basin with a sharp clink. "One," she muttered. She went back in. It took an hour. An hour of Gareth thrashing, growling, and bleeding. Emily found 4 more shards of silver. By the time she pulled the last one out, she was covered in his blood up to her elbows, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. Gareth had passed out again, his body going limp against the furs. "Sew him up, Corin," Emily said, stepping off the bed. Her legs felt like water, but she locked her knees. She walked to the wash basin and plunged her bloody hands into the cold water. She stayed awake for 3 days. The fever hit Gareth an hour after the surgery. He burned with an unnatural heat, thrashing in the heavy furs, muttering in a language Emily didn't understand. She sat in the wooden chair beside the bed, forcing water between his cracked lips, placing cold, wet cloths on his forehead and wiping the sweat from his chest. Vane came in on the second night. He stood awkwardly by the door, holding a bowl of broth. "You should sleep, my lady." He rumbled gently. "He is strong. The Alpha's blood fights the poison. If he dies, Vane Master Hewitt will hear of it by spring," Emily said, not taking her eyes off Gareth's face. She re-wet the cloth in a basin of snowmelt. "And he will march a mercenary army up that pass to take his gold back. I am not letting this man die. We have too much paperwork to finish." Vane chuckled softly. It was a sad, heavy sound. "You have a cold mouth, Lady Emily, but a very fierce heart." He left the broth on the table and walked out. On the evening of the 3rd day, the wind outside finally died down to a low moan. The room was quiet, save for the crackle of the hearth. Emily was dozing in the chair, her head resting on the edge of the mattress, her hand lightly resting over Gareth's forearm. She felt the shift in his breathing first. It deepened, evening out. The brutal radiating heat of his fever broke, replaced by his normal, furnace-like warmth. A heavy, rough hand turned over and loosely gripped her fingers. Emily's eyes snapped open. She sat up. Gareth was awake. He looked battered. His face gaunt under his thick beard, but his eyes were clear. They were human again, a pale, striking amber in the firelight. He looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the wrinkled, blood-stained dress she hadn't changed out of, and the basin of murky water beside her. "You stayed—" His voice was a ruined croak, dry as parchment. Emily reached for the cup of water on the nightstand supporting the back of his neck as she tipped the water into his mouth. He drank greedily. Of course I stayed, Emily said, setting the cup down. Her voice was steady, but her throat felt tight. You are a terrible steward of your own keep. If I left you to Corin, you would have bled to death, and I refuse to manage this pack alone. Gareth let his head fall back against the pillows. He let out a long, exhausted breath. He didn't let go of her hand. His thumb weakly stroked the ink-stained calluses on her knuckles. They told me, Gareth murmured. In the haze. Vane said you dug the silver out yourself, that you ordered them around like dogs. They were acting like dogs. Someone had to. A faint smile touched Gareth's cracked lips. He turned his head on the pillow, looking at her with an intensity that made Emily's breath hitch. There was no arrogance in his gaze, no predatory edge, just a deep, anchoring reverence. I was prepared to be a warden, Gareth said softly. A jailer to a southern lord's terrified daughter. That is what the treaty demanded. I am not terrified, Emily said. I know. Gareth's grip on her hand tightened slightly. You are my queen, in blood, not just in ink. He closed his eyes, his breathing returning to the steady rhythm of sleep. Emily sat in the chair, looking down at their joined hands. For the first time since she arrived at Hyridge, she let a single tear slip down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Gareth's recovery was brutally slow. For a werewolf, being confined to a bed was a psychological torture, but Emily was merciless. When he tried to stand on the 5th day, she simply sat in the only doorway with a ledger in her lap, and told him he would have to step on her to leave. He went back to bed grumbling about southern stubbornness. But peace was a fleeting thing in the north. 10 days after the silver poisoning, Torin burst into the bedchamber. He didn't bother knocking. Gareth was sitting up in a chair by the fire, whittling a piece of pine. Emily was at her desk, tallying the grain reserves. Riders. Torin gasped, his chest heaving. A scouting party just returned from the Redwater River Gorge. There is an army camped on the southern bank. Gareth's knife stopped. He looked up, his eyes flashing gold. Whose banner? The Blue Falcon, my lord, Torin said, swallowing hard. House Arryn, and the Green Boar of Lord Godfrey. 400 men, armoured infantry siege ladders and mercenaries. Emily's quill snapped in her fingers. Ink bled across the parchment. The Blue Falcon. Her father. Alden. Gareth growled. The sound was monstrous, vibrating the floorboards. He gripped the arms of his chair, trying to stand, but a sharp hiss of pain escaped his teeth as his ribs pulled. Emily stood up. She walked over to Gareth, placed a firm hand on his uninjured shoulder, and forced him to remain seated. Why is my father marching? Emily asked, looking at Torin. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. The rumours, my lady, Torin said, shifting uncomfortably. The poachers who laid the traps, they were Godfrey's men. They rode south and told your father that the Alpha King was dead, that the pack was broken and leaderless. Lord Alden believes the treaty is void. He wants the salt mines. And... Torin hesitated. And he wants me back. Emily finished her tone flat. So he can sell me to Lord Godfrey for a higher price now that he already has your winter wheat. Gareth let out a roar. He shattered the wooden armrest of his chair, forcing himself to his feet. His sheer size dwarfed the room. I will rip his head from his shoulders and mount it on the gates. I will drown his men in the Redwater. You will do no such thing, Emily snapped. She stepped directly in front of him, forcing him to look down at her. You are injured. The pack is outnumbered 4-1, and Godfrey brought armoured mercenaries. If you meet them on an open field in your condition, they will slaughter you. I am the king, Gareth snarled, leaning down, his face inches from hers. The beast was entirely at the surface. They march on my lands. They come to take my mate. I will not cower behind walls. I am not telling you to hour," Emily shouted back, refusing to give an inch of ground. "I am telling you to use your head. They are marching into the mountains in the dead of winter. They are arrogant southern fools wearing steel plates in freezing temperatures. We do not need to bleed for this victory, Gareth. We just need to be smart." Gareth stared at her, his chest heaving. The heavy, ragged breaths slowly began to calm. The gold in his eyes receded, leaving the pale amber. He looked at the shattered wood in his hand and dropped it. "What is your plan, Emily?" he asked, his voice dropping to a rough rasp. Emily turned to Torin. "Summon Vane and Kyle. Bring the valley maps. We are holding a war council." 30 minutes later, the heavy oak table in their chamber was covered in unrolled maps held down by iron daggers. Cale Vane and Torin stood around it, radiating nervous, aggressive energy. Gareth stood beside Emily, leaning heavily on the table, his face tight with pain, but his focus absolute. Emily pointed to a narrow, jagged line on the map. "The Serpent's Pass," Emily said. "If they want to reach Hyridge, they have to march their army through this gorge. It is flanked by sheer cliffs on both sides." "It's a choke point," Kyle grunted. "Good for an ambush. We put 50 men at the top, rain arrows down on them." "No," Emily said. "Arrows will bounce off Godfrey's steel plate. We don't shoot them. We bury them." She traced a finger along the mountain ridges above the pass. "The snow drifts on the eastern ridge are 10 feet deep. The rocks beneath them are unstable slate. I read it in Vane's old patrol logs." She looked up at the steward. "You lost 3 pack mules there 2 years ago to a rock slide." Vane nodded slowly. "Aye, the ground is treacherous." "Torin," Emily commanded, "take 20 of your fastest, lightest wolves. Shift to your beast forms. You will scale the western ridge tonight under the cover of darkness. Stay out of sight. When my father's army marches into the center of the gorge tomorrow at noon, you will trigger the eastern drift. Roll the boulders, break the ice, bring the mountain down on their supply train and their rear guard." Torin's eyes widened. A feral grin spread across his face. "We cut off their retreat." "Exactly," Emily said. "You trap them in the gorge, they will be pinned between a wall of snow and Hyridge Keep. And then," she looked up at Gareth, her eyes burning with a dark, ruthless fire, "we ride out and offer them a choice. Surrender and crawl back south, or freeze to death in the pass." Gareth stared at her. The 3 veteran warlords stared at her. "By the gods!" Kyle whispered. "She is more vicious than we are." Gareth let out a low, rumbling laugh that ended in a wince as his ribs caught. He looked at Emily, absolute awe radiating from his scarred face. "Saddle the horses," Gareth ordered the men. "The Queen has given her commands." The air in the Serpent's Pass was brittle with cold. Lord Alden rode at the front of his column wrapped in heavy furs, though his lips were already blue. Beside him rode Lord Godfrey, a large, arrogant man atop a grey gelding wearing a steel breastplate that was frosting over in the wind. Behind them marched 400 mercenaries, shivering and miserable, their boots crunching loudly on the packed ice. They had reached the narrowest point of the gorge. Suddenly, a sound echoed off the sheer rock walls. It wasn't a horn. It was a deep, rumbling groan that vibrated in the marrow of their bones. Alden pulled his horse to a halt, looking up. High above them on the eastern ridge, the snow was moving. It started as a trickle, then a wave, and then a deafening, catastrophic roar. A massive wall of white snow, black slate, and uprooted pine trees cascaded down the mountain. It didn't hit the vanguard. It slammed into the rear of the column. Wagons shattered like kindling. The panicked screams of horses and men were instantly swallowed by the roar of the avalanche. When the snow settled, a massive, impenetrable wall of ice and rock blocked the gorge behind them. "Treason!" Godfrey shouted, drawing his sword, his horse dancing in a panic. "It's a trap! Look!" A mercenary screamed, pointing forward. At the northern mouth of the pass, emerging from the driving snow like ghosts, came the wolves of Hyridge. There were only 60 of them, but they looked like a nightmare. Half of them were fully shifted, massive, hulking beasts of dark fur and yellow eyes, their jaws snapping in the frigid air. The other half rode heavy war horses gripping iron battle axes. At the center of the line rode 2 figures. Gareth sat atop his black destrier. He wore no armor, only a heavy dark tunic and his wolf pelt mantle. He looked pale, but he sat straight, a colossal monument of violence, holding a massive broadsword resting on his pommel. Beside him, riding a swift grey mare, was Emily. She did not look like the quiet, submissive daughter Lord Alden had sold. She wore a heavy cloak of silver fox fur over a dark riding habit. Her hair was braided back tightly, her posture rigid, her chin held high. She looked like the very mountain itself, immovable and cold. The Hyridge line stopped 50 yards away. Emily nudged her mare forward a few paces. Gareth moved his horse in perfect synchronization, staying glued to her flank. "Father." Emily's voice rang out, carrying easily over the wind. Lord Alden stared at her, his jaw slack. "Emily, but the scouts said the beast was dead, that the pack was feral." "Your scouts are as incompetent as your ledgers, father," Emily said loudly, ensuring every mercenary in the vanguard heard her. "King Gareth is very much alive, and the pack is entirely disciplined." She let her gaze sweep over the shivering, terrified southern army. "You have marched an armed force into the northern reaches. You have violated the treaty. Your rear guard is buried under 50 tons of ice, and your supply train is destroyed." Godfrey spurred his horse forward, pointing his sword at Emily. "You arrogant little girl! We have 400 swords. We will butcher these beasts, and I will drag you back to my bed by your hair." A deafening, earth-shaking roar erupted from Gareth. The sound was so violent, so full of pure, lethal promise, that Godfrey's horse reared in terror, nearly throwing the lord into the snow. The fully shifted wolves in the Hyridge line dropped to their haunches, muscles coiled, waiting for the command to slaughter. Emily did not flinch. She just looked at Godfrey with utter disdain. "You have 400 men who are currently freezing to death in a trap, Lord Godfrey," Emily said coldly. "Steel armor conducts the cold. By nightfall, half your men will have frostbite. By morning, you will be dead." She turned her eyes back to her father. Alden was trembling, staring at the monstrous beasts surrounding his daughter. "You made a trade, father," Emily said, her voice dropping, the theatrical volume becoming intimate and cruel. "You traded me for wheat. It was the worst deal you ever made because you handed the North the one thing they lacked, a mind to rule them. I am the Queen of Hyridge. These are my lands, and you will leave them." She pulled a rolled parchment from her saddlebag and tossed it onto the snow in front of Alden's horse. "That is a new treaty," Emily commanded. "House Arryn forfeits all claims to the Redwater grazing lands. You will pay a tax of 500 silver pieces a year to Hyridge for attempting this treason. If you do not sign it right now, my husband will kill you, and I will not look away." Alden looked at the parchment. He looked at the towering, wrathful Alpha King. He looked at his daughter, whose eyes held absolutely no mercy. He climbed down off his horse, his knees shaking. He knelt in the snow, pulled a charcoal stub from his pouch, and signed the paper. "Leave," Emily ordered. "Climb over the ice block. Walk home. If any of your men are found in the pass by sunset, the wolves will eat them." She turned her horse. Gareth turned his. Together they rode back toward the fortress, the pack falling into perfect, disciplined formation behind them. That night, the fires in the Hyridge bedchamber burned brighter than ever. The keep was quiet, the adrenaline of the day finally bleeding away into exhaustion. Emily stood by the hearth, untying the heavy laces of her silver fox cloak. Her hands were shaking slightly, the delayed shock of staring down an army finally catching up to her. A heavy, warm hand covered hers, stopping her trembling fingers. Gareth stood behind her. He gently moved her hands away and untied the laces himself, letting the heavy fur slip from her shoulders to the floor. He stepped closer, his chest pressing lightly against her back. His heat soaked into her skin through her thin dress. "You didn't have to protect me today." Gareth murmured his voice, a low, rough rumble near her ear. "I wasn't protecting you." Emily whispered, closing her eyes as he rested his chin on the top of her head. "I was protecting my pack." Gareth turned her around. He looked down at her, his amber eyes burning with a fire that had nothing to do with violence. He reached up his large, calloused hands, gently framing her face. He stroked her cheekbones with his thumbs, a touch so incredibly tender, it broke the last remaining walls around Emily's cynical heart. "I expected a transaction," Gareth said softly, his breath brushing her lips. "I expected a terrified girl to hide in my towers while I fought the world alone. I didn't expect an equal." Emily looked up at the scarred, brutal, beautiful man who had handed her his kingdom. "I expected a monster," she breathed. "I didn't expect a partner." Gareth leaned down. There was no hesitation, no holding back. He kissed her. It was deep claiming and desperate, sealing the bond between them, not with a bloody thumbprint on parchment, but with absolute, chosen devotion. Emily wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to the beast who had become her home, and the alpha who had finally found his queen. Wow, what an incredible journey for Emily and Gareth. From a forced marriage to becoming the ultimate power couple of the Northern Reaches, Emily proved that a sharp mind is just as lethal as sharp claws. Did you love seeing her outsmart the Southern Lords and claim her place as the Alpha Queen? If this story gave you all the feels, smash that like button and subscribe for more original romance dramas. Share this video with someone who loves a strong, intelligent heroine and a deeply devoted werewolf king. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite Emily moment? See you in the next story.